This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Ludicrous speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hello, and welcome, one and all, to another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. It's your girl, BK. With me today, yes, indeed, is Jack. How are you doing on this fine day?
I'm doing great on this Tuesday, November 1st, because I get to wish my co-host, BK, a very special happy birthday. So from past me to you, BK, happy birthday.
Oh, well, why, thank you, past Jack. I am very appreciative towards the birthday wishes. And I'm so excited to be talking about an amazing film today on this very special day. And that is the animated film, and I will deem it a classic to me, and we'll get into it, is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse 2018. Yes. So happy we are covering this. This is so good. This is necessary. This is needed. This is an amazing effing film, Jack.
Oh, for a birthday pick, honestly, you kind of knocked it out of the park. I will back you up on that modern classic label. It's not often that I am very, covetous of that for modern films, but when it's something that is so... I don't know. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse leaves a mark on you for how unique an experience it is.
It is truly a unique experience from its conception to its execution. It does something that no other animated film has ever done before. And it does something for a superhero film that I think has not been done before. And we are still in what people like to deem the peak superhero era. And it's only going to get better. And I think it's really genuinely because of this film. And I think it's kind of surprising to hear me say that.
Well, no, I get it. Especially because I know you are a huge animation aficionado. And one of the reasons that I give this that modern classic label is because of the fact that it takes several revolutionary steps forward in the way that animation goes down. And it really does it through the kind of archetypal superhero story that we're all very accustomed to at this point.
Oh, 100%. I feel like it's something so unique about this film where it can take a very typical superhero story and really make it unique by introducing a new character that is the current Spider-Man in the comics and bringing it to a mainstream audience. A lot of people didn't really know about Miles Morales, at least the mainstreamers. And I guess so. It makes sense. He's just another spider person who gets bit by the spider. But he has his own story. And his story is very unique. Because when Miles gets bit by the spider, he also actually is a person who witnesses his current Spider-Man's murder. And this murder is happening underneath an interdimensional, multidimensional portal, which bursts open the wall, I think, for a Marvel film. And brings in an amazing lens to a universe that I think comic book creators and lovers only really know, and brings it to a platform and an audience that has never really dived into the first multiversal film, in my opinion.
It's such an intelligent nod to superhero films and superhero history that's come before it, and it's so grounded in comic book techniques. Yet it has so much to say that's new about the typical Spider-Man story about responsibility. And I think that the value of that is that it's a really well-told parable, told in a really accessible way. And honestly, BK, I don't know about you, but that's kind of what I feel the value of superhero films to be.
I think superhero films are really stories about an everyday person being able to become an everyday hero and kind of really taking on responsibility that is often thrusted upon them, not by choice. And these are stories and themes that really resonate with people. So when you have a world like the Marvel Ultimate Universe, where there are so many characters and so many different superheroes to kind of get behind, it's kind of hard to figure out where to start, who to pick, what character to focus on. And I quite frankly think Miles Morales was the right person and tells such a unique story that is not only good for his individual experience, but for a comic book universe. I mean, superhero films are very controversial right now, with some of them being held to crazy standards, but at the same time, hitting with a lot of scrutiny because of its adaptation and what it means. And the conversation kind of goes back and forth, Jack. And I know you and me have had tiffs over this, very healthy tiffs of our opinions on superhero films.
My problem in these debates is that I always feel like I'm stuck in a framing of conversation that I don't agree with. What I mean is that the conversation is usually about the value of superhero films critically being held up against the all-time high art classics. You know, comparing something like Iron Man to The Godfather. And I just think it's a really faulty premise. You know, I've talked a lot passionately on this podcast about my love for both quote-unquote low art and high art. And I think the reason that I accept both is because both have different but unique and interesting ways of telling those stories that we all share in common in valuable, accessible ways. I don't know about you, BK. Like, I just think people need to stop competing with themselves on this. Art is like love. You know, it's not a finite thing. The more art you consume, the more informed you are. To argue that superhero films don't have this similar value to the highest of high art, like, stop doing that to yourselves. Like, you're cutting yourselves off from accessing different levels of art.
I love how you put that. And I think, you know, me not being the film industry aficionado that you are, I really haven't heard some of these terms before, but the way you've laid it out here and using superheroes as the basis of it really has educated me a bit on the form of art. And I have to agree with you. I have a newfound love and appreciation for the very low art, you're saying the B art that you've just described. And you're right. We like to put out here on the interwebs that Endgame is one of the best films of all time. And it's kind of hard to put that next to a film that I literally think is one of the best films of all time, like, I don't know, Alien. I'm going to keep saying that till the day I die. But they're in different realms. They're in different lanes. It's kind of hard. You're doing a disservice to both of the films to even genuinely compare them together. And I know that makes people get up in arms and get angry. And listen, I don't think we're saying they're bad. Do not take it that way. But you have to look at what it is for what it is and appreciate it for what it is. And I think that's down to the very art form and the types of art forms that superhero films are, is they are just trying to be unapologetically comic books on screen. And let's be honest, comic books are weird and totally nerdy, and it's been a niche thing for a very, very long time in its history. Comic books did not start out as poppin' as we all seem to kind of take for granted nowadays, I have to say.
To criticize superhero films, you know, modern folklore, essentially, for being derivative, is to criticize all folklore. Let's not get it twisted. When you go back to the traditions and the roots that gave us superheroes, you're talking about ancient epics like Gilgamesh, the Labors of Hercules, Beowulf, the stories of King Arthur and Robin Hood, the modern tales of Zorro and Tarzan. Those don't have any sort of ridiculous artistic quality above the modern superhero films that we're seeing if you go back and look at them and scrutinize them. Beowulf is essentially just an action film with a couple of feast scenes transcribed in Old English. Like, there's a reason that story has lasted, because it has that kind of universal appeal of a conquering hero. And that's where this tradition really roots itself.
Oh, I love that you've brought it here, Jack. Are you kidding me? Achilles, like, once I started hearing even just mythos, a lot of the stories of like gods or even archetypes of some of the very heroes that we love and appreciate today. It's something so simple about having them be an expert or some sort of tragedy, defining who they are, What is their weakness? Will they triumph against all odds? These themes are the same themes in those epics you've mentioned, in those stories that I feel we kind of forget existed.
It's 100% the basis of comic books and the modern hero tale as we tell it. You know, in early Hollywood cinema, particularly King Arthur, Robin Hood, Zorro, and Tarzan would become fixations with filmmakers, as well as the pulp novelists of the time who were churning out pulp magazines and these very accessible tales for the average reader to pick up at the newsstand. And that's where you start getting these original characters in the 20s and 30s, like the Shadow and the Spider. And this whole tradition is sort of culminating and heading towards the superhero idea, but it really starts with a transitionary figure in 1936, and probably my favorite hero of all time, BK. I'm talking about the Phantom, believe it or not.
What? The Phantom? Your favorite? I wouldn't have pegged you for that.
Well, basically because I love the Billy Zane film. To be talked about on another podcast or in other forms elsewhere, I could geek out about it for hours. Anyway, on February 17th, 1936, Lee Falk's The Phantom debuts in newspapers as a comic strip. And he is, for all intents and purposes, the first costumed hero, to the point where he originates tropes like the skin-tight suit. He originates the mask with no pupils in the eyes, like very basic details about what we understand a superhero to be in terms of the look and the feel of the hero. But he was also posed in this pulp novel world of heroes where he was based on wealth and influence. He was a wealthy playboy that had the access and the ability to do this. It's a tradition that started in those pulp novels, but it wasn't until we get Action Comics #1 that we have an out-and-out superhero, a man of circumstances where he is physically imbued with powers. It's not just a rich guy solving crimes.
I'm glad you've called that out because, again, as one of my favorite superheroes, and again, very controversial, La Batman, he is merely what? A rich man who's trained in martial arts because he lives and comes from that origin and that realm. And that trope is seen in tons of heroes, and it's a trope now. So to find out where that origin is from, I looked up the Phantom. Y'all have to look up what this dude looks like. It is so funny. But you're right. It's a template. I can see the direct translation. And then to kind of think about, okay, well, Action Comics #1 releasing what? That Superman, I'm guessing. That is a character who is defined by not their money, but by power, a physical power that is like not of this earth, I guess, literally.
Yeah, it's very different. It's less capitalistic and it's more like the Nietzschean Übermensch idea, that there's this great man imbued with great powers. And that idea that underneath a humble exterior, anybody could end up being a all-powerful superhero, that was the broad appeal that brought people to Superman and really started to popularize the comic book art form and the superhero as an iconoclast. But because of the fact that this great man idea, much as it did in politics, also had very strong associations with white supremacy, this led to a problem and a bit of a dark side in this era of comics, because racist tropes and racist pablum was applied to a lot of different comic strips and comic books, almost as a de facto part of the writing at the time.
No, I was going to say, you said Uber something. That sounds pretty Nazi to me. I'm good on that. But like, I didn't actually dive into this. This is a little trauma for me to kind of look up things. How racist did it get, Jack? Like, was it bad? Is there a dark history that I don't know?
Well, I mean, all literature at this time that discussed race in any way, shape, or form was vaguely informed by two traditions in, at very least, Western culture. One of them was the imperialist writing style that would come out of Europe and its rape of Africa. I'm talking about stuff like, Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, or, in comic terms, Georges Remy's 1010 series. The idea of people who were not white Europeans as lazy, stupid, aggressive, and these racist tropes were also very prevalent and present in American culture via minstrelsy and the minstrel shows of the 19th century. So these stereotypes were something that permeated into comics as well, while they were a all-white depiction of society. It was a natural sort of extension of white supremacy. And in 1947, these were the forces that black journalist Orrin C. Evans identified and decided to counteract with the establishment of all-Negro comics.
Finally, we are here. Because I knew it was bad, but I guess as a blurred, as a black nerd, you kind of just start where we start. And boy, to know that it was that weird of a journey and to see that the tropes have kind of come even into a comic book art form. I mean, it makes sense, but also it gets me pissed still. So to find out about Orrin Evans and to find out that there's an all-Negro comics is awesome there. Like, that is a place where you can elevate other black writers and comics to give them like a platform to be able to tell their stories through their lens and not through someone else who is clearly doing it with racist intentions.
And that was his direct aim, was to make sure that he was elevating these artists and writers who were not going to get an opportunity in Jim Crow segregated society to create art at a high level. And it led to a really robust stable of early black heroes, names like Ace Harlem, Bubba, Sugarfoot, Snake Oil, and Drew Dillies. But the centerpiece of All Negro Comics brand, and the most important creation that they had by far, was Lion Man, who was the first black superhero.
Lion Man! Gosh, I love that we're doing this. Like, we're getting into this. I feel like people don't know about this. This is stuff that I have to ask people now when I go up. I'm like, hey, do you actually know about the first black superhero? Because a lot of people are going to be like, what, is it Black Panther? And I'm like, there's a whole little era before we get there.
And he was portrayed the same way, crucially, as those wealthy millionaires in the early serials like The Shadow and The Spider. He was portrayed as a wealthy, American-born, college-educated scientist. He was given the opportunity to be that playboy. He was tasked by the UN. He was given responsibility to protect the world's largest supply of uranium on Africa's Gold Coast. He had a massive technological prowess and technological advances that he had built for himself as a character. He had earned the opportunity in the world of Lion Man to be seen as the hero that he became.
There's something so important to be able to have that story as well. A lot of times when black people do have to tell their own stories, we get hit with criticisms of being like, oh, you need to be original or make your own stories. I'm like, sometimes we just want to be that version. I want to be the rich playboy. I want to be the smart person. I don't want to have to be someone who comes from the inner city or a hero that is a slave. Like, I'm going to be a hero that is like other superheroes I have seen. You didn't have to be a white person to be a superhero. And I really feel like that is kind of what the stories that we're trying to tell in a way at a higher level. I mean, Evans really believed that like comics were a serious storytelling medium that a lot of people have kind of challenged to this day, whether or not we should take comic book stories seriously. So to kind of hear that someone in our history of blurredism, I'm making up words now, is so adamant that comics can tell these stories at this level is awesome to me. And I'm so happy to be able to like share that. And I'm so glad that you have brought us here, Jack, because this is stuff that we don't talk about and we don't really know. And I know that it didn't end very well. Obviously, it got hit with a lot of harsh criticism, especially at that time. That's black propaganda. Shut it down. But clearly that didn't stop us from getting where we are today, where we have some of the most iconic heroes. Yes, I said that. Of all time that happened to be black, okay? And we have to get into it, Jack, because he's one of my favorites, and that is our legendary Black Panther. Yes, coming in with Marvel's comics there. I want to know how much of the story you know, though, Jack, because I've done my wiki dives on this eons ago.
I don't know a ton about Black Panther, but I will say this on the subject, is that I think that it's really important to recognize that Lion Man, beyond just being a black superhero and being that liberating image, he also established something very important in the marketplace that Marvel would finally start to understand during the civil rights movement, which is that there was a huge black readership for comic books that just did not have anybody who looked like them within the pages of Marvel and DC. And so as much as I know is that Jack Kirby really took it upon himself to change that.
Comic books are a little bit established at this point, right? Like this is very poppin'. And you've said it earlier in your points that comics are accessible. I mean, I've tried to read Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky is not simple read, okay? I mean, shoot, Tolkien is not an easy read. Like, books are not easy. They really aren't. But there's something about the comic book medium, the combination of the writing and the visuals and the stories that they tell, that it has a very great barrier to entry. It is very low. It is very accessible. I mean, let's be real. Let's call it like it is. I mean, Black people were delayed on literacy for a very, very long time. So comic books were really where you would get these kind of stories that would tell the messages that I think we needed to hear. You know, when we think about them, when we think about novels that are out there, what representation are we getting? I mean, some classic literature I was forced to grow up on was To Kill a Mockingbird. And let's talk about the Black people in that, Jack. Like, we didn't get a lot of rep, okay? So I'm glad Marvel was like, hey, we need to fix this in the 60s, all right?
And they did a good job of it because they created a character who was portrayed much the same way Lion Man was. Only instead of being this wealthy businessman, he was a regal, benevolent ruler of his own country who was perfectly capable through his guile and his intelligence and his resources of protecting his own people. And crucially in the 60s, this was a massive departure from the blaxploitation genre that was prevalent in all media at the time. In the same way that Sidney Poitier was breaking ground in the realm of film and how Black people could be depicted with dignity in that medium, Black Panther was a departure from these blaxploitation stereotypes that Black people could only be portrayed as hustlers or as criminals or as pimps or as, you know, being overly slick. Black Panther is huge.
He really is. And you've said a really lot in context with like kind of mainstream media, because we're at a place now where we need to look at all of these different forms of media at the same time. So to kind of like, as a nerd, when you learn that like comic books were really trying to kind of get into this world and actually represent different walks of life in a real way is awesome to hear and to kind of break down, because Black Panther really was someone who came from stature. He is a character that was not any of the stereotypes that did exist at the time. Someone who is royalty, someone who is good at making decisions, someone who is a leader, right? That typically Black Panther doesn't want violence, but isn't afraid to use it. And we love that in heroes. And a lot of that sentiment of a Black hero, of recognizing the existence and the need for force, but not wanting to have to use it, is, I think, a theme that is seen in a lot of Black heroes, especially as we get into characters like Luke Cage or even Black Lightning, where they want to educate and work through stories, work through conflict before inevitably having to use fists or powers. And I quite frankly think that is such a strong theme to still see throughout.
But at the same time, comics obviously still had a massive problem with race to reckon with. I mean, you mentioned Black Lightning and the steps that he took as a guy who had an alter ego as an educator, also functioning as a superhero. He only comes into existence because DC had to be saved from itself, because they were going to try and make their first Black hero probably one of the worst concepts I've ever heard of in my life. It was described, actually, by DC staff as an insult to practically everybody with any point of view at all. And this character is the infamous Black Bomber.
I literally, every time I hear about this, I just have to laugh, Jack. Like, it's bad. It's really bad. Like, there's racist and then there's this, okay? Like,
this is what we refer to as cartoonishly racist.
It's so bad. I can't even say it. I literally can't even, like, my brain goes, cannot compute.
I'm gonna say it once because I absolutely hate everything about this. But the Black Bomber was supposed to be a white racist who, when put under stress like the Hulk, turned into a black man. This was DC's idea of, let's introduce a Black character to the DC universe.
It's true. I'm laughing. I'm sorry, Jack. It's just every time I cannot believe someone fixed their face and said, oh my God, yes, this is a good idea. We should run with this. Like, no, at a full stop.
Thank goodness DC made the right call to hire Luke Cage creator Tony Isabella to come to the label to create the Black Lightning character and actually steer them on a, let's just say, more righteous path, shall we? But I think a cool thing to note from this period is while Black Lightning was being developed, Black Vulcan would show up on the animated show Super Friends, which I loved as a kid, and he would actually become the first ever black superhero in animation.
I didn't learn about Black Vulcan until you tossed in the notes. And to see that translation there come over to animation where I'm like, all right, so does it like, it's got to have not stopped there.
Well, it all fits into a real trend of superheroes becoming more and more popular through the late 70s. You know, you have TV shows like Wonder Woman. You have in 1978 Richard Donner create the Superman film, which was the first ever big budget superhero blockbuster. And this momentum both commercially paved the way at the box office for films like Tim Burton's Batman later in 1989, but it really just allowed the superhero to become a zeitgeist figure beyond the pages of the comic book.
As a youngin', I'm looking at this timeline and I'm like, well, I didn't realize we were kind of born into the golden age of nerdom. When we think about it, Jack, like our conception must have been predetermined that we were going to be nerds, because finding out the timeline of kind of the popularity and the boomingness of superheroes. I mean, my mom, the most valid girl, white girl you probably could find, was into comics and knew of superheroes and went to see these movies against all stereotypes that kind of are still around today, that women might not be into this, that comic books are niche. This whole superheroism fandom has definitely been exploding long before our time.
And Donner's Superman is really kind of the primary cause for that, though Tim Burton's Batman would elevate it in our lifetimes. But, you know, really it was an accessible thing. Gone were the days of the 50s and the 60s where it was seen as something creepy, something that was socially unacceptable or socially awkward to have in your life. And nerd culture was something that anybody could embrace and they could sculpt to their own image. And this is where, during the renaissance of black culture that was coming out in the late 80s and early 90s, we finally start to get on cinema our first black superheroes. First, we're talking about 1993's The Meteor Man, starring Robert Townsend as Meteor Man. And then 1 year later, in 1994, Damon Wayans would play Blank Man.
It doesn't stop there, but I feel like what did those really well is that they kind of messed around with the world of comedy and parody, which I think is a very black experience, messing around with humor and being funny and witty as hell, and kind of also implementing a subtle commentary on things with that wit and humor. So when we have the Meteor Man, when we have Blank Man, like that is kind of a unique black culture we're getting on screen.
Well, not only that, but I think what's interesting about both of those films is they seize on the very same themes that you were seeing in films by people like John Singleton and the Hughes brothers at the time. I mean, Lawrence Fishburne's speech on the way that the ghetto is being taken advantage of by businesses in Boys in the Hood is very similar to the kind of evil that Blank Man is fighting when he's going up against the corruption of the political establishment in a comedy parody film about superheroes. And it was a really interesting to me way to see that the black community started bringing superheroes to the screen by almost disguising the issues that they wanted to talk about in their art through this comedy. You know, it's not a mistake that the guys behind In Living Color were all over Blank Man. It's not a mistake that in Meteor Man you had the brilliant wits in Cypress Hill and Naughty by Nature playing bit parts. Like, these were films by artists that knew what they were doing.
I feel like this is a great way to kind of keep launching us into our current hero that we are talking about of this film, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, is, you know, how do we get to a hero like Miles Morales? And he is a great modern day representation of what I think a hero like a Spider-Man, you know, someone who's just from the block would be. But that hero wouldn't have been available to exist if it wasn't for the many on-screen black heroes that we've seen all through, I think, my upbringing and what I grew up on.
Yeah, and mine as well. We really did grow up at the cutting edge of this movement because, you would have performances like in 1994, Carl Lumley would play Mantis, TV's first black superhero. And he would take on, as his evil, police corruption in what is a very potent theme in a very shoddily made show. But then it would take another step forward in 1997 when Michael Jai White would portray Spawn. And he was the first black superhero on film to be allowed to face larger-than-life odds and stakes. It wasn't just about fighting in his own community. Spawn was literally using hell powers to fight for good. And it all leads us to the birth of Marvel in theatrical film in 1998 with the originator of the MCU, Blade.
Yes, and I'm glad you said it, Jack, because that's what he is. OG with the OG. Talk about the first superhero on screen for realsies. Bro, my guy Wesley Snipes really did define and really just bring the character Blade to life in such an amazing way. And that film, for me, is honestly probably definitely one of the reasons I'm into nerd stuff to this day, especially with the way they've done it and the character that Blade is. It is such a interesting story rooted in themes that we all kind of know. I mean, vampires, right? But ever seen a black vampire? I'll do you one better. How about a superhero black vampire? It is awesome to see it and to see a conflict that is not personal, like you said. It is a gritty and very real story and a very real character, although he is physically super powered. I love it, and it sparked so much more.
His character is pivotal to creating what we understand to be the modern superhero ethos. He is this cool, unaffected badass who has a sarcastic wit and sense of humor. And just in a physical way, he uses martial arts and his physical prowess to defeat his enemies. I mean, this would be a deep influence later on Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. But you do have this influence also carry over into allowing more and more black superheroes to show up. This is when in 2000, we get Static Shock, which is the first black superhero to have their own animated TV series. That very same year, we get X-Men, where Halle Berry is the first woman to portray a black superhero. Although we had, shoutouts to Eartha Kitt, had a black supervillain back in the 60s, Halle Berry was the first one who got to don that cape, as it were, and actually be a hero.
Yes, and again, direct inspirations for me. I mean, y'all have seen me cosplay. You can see how these series and these movies and having this representation has affected me as a black woman. And so to kind of really think about it, I mean, if we're being quite literally honest, black heroes have made and established the MCU, and it doesn't stop there. I mean, as we get into the common day MCU with a lot of the characters that we have, we do see them in some of the famous films that y'all champion today. I love it. I love seeing it. I mean, these are stories that needed to be told. With Static Shock, we get to see, a younger angle of being a superhero. With X-Men, we get to see a black person in a group, in a team setting, in a dynamic. And it continues as the Avengers evolve and as we get into the superhero revival period of the early 2000s.
Honestly, I think it's really cool to have gone back in this history and tracked all of these forebears and the way that the black community had to, on its own, really build its own superhero culture and its own voice in that conversation. Because when we get to the superhero revival period, when the Dark Knight trilogy and Iron Man sort of birth this renewed interest and sort of cement superhero films as tentpoles today, the black community was in a position to have an equal voice in the conversation over how these superhero films play out. They had the opportunity, with this incredible mass of content, to elevate their own voices and to give themselves the opportunity to create something like a Luke Cage TV show, to create something like the film Black Panther.
And it doesn't stop just there being represented on screen. And I think that's definitely the point, like you're pointing out to, is as we became more represented, as our voices started to be heard, we got more and more behind the scenes. We got more and more able to tell our own stories and have the resources to tell them at the same level as the white counterparts there. which I think really leads up to a pivotal moment for me and for all blurs out there, which is the Black Panther film, and seeing Chadwick Boseman depict T'Challa and have a film that is so rooted in Black culture and African culture behind the scenes and in front of the scenes is such a great, I feel like, just pivotal moment. You said tentpole, it's such a good word for the culmination of the crazy history that has been, and a setup and kind of roadmap for what is to come.
And I think it's not a coincidence that this movie, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, comes out to bookend the very same year, because it involved, as you've been mentioning, Miles Morales, who was himself a deep flashpoint in comic culture when he came to our pages in 2011.
It is insane what Miles did for the comics outside of what he does for representation. If we want to be serious here, I'm so happy that there is an Afro-Latina hero, but none of his existence would be possible if it weren't for the Spider-Man history that has built his existence. I mean, he is the Spider-Man that kind of brings everyone in to the multiverse of that world at a very prominent moment in the comic books. Like, plot, like his existence as a character is super important, and it made people get very vocal about his introduction. You really don't change Spider-Man.
Well, hang on a second, BK. Like, Spider-Man is Spider-Man and has been just Spider-Man in as much as, like, I don't know. That's a kind of a falsehood, don't you think? Because we've had derivatives of Spider-Man for almost as long as the comic has existed.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm more trying to draw attention that Miles kind of bridged that gap between the separate worlds of Spider-Mans. Like, we always had our Peter Parker. We always relied on him for a while. And I think for a lot of the time, people thought that was their main Spider-Man. That's the main continuity. But other Spider-Mans existed. And so many of them have. I mean, it's a Spider-Verse, to your point, Jack.
I remember when Miles Morales showed up, because I was in college at the time, and I remember going around Union Square in the comic sellers and hearing about it, and hearing the negative voices. It was this outrage ecosystem that we all know exists in certain circles in this country. These loudmouths who say very vitriolic and, quite frankly, racist things in order to gin up controversies where none exist. You know, Miles Morales, if you look at the history of Spider-Man, he is just another variant of the same exact hero. Whether it is Peter Parker or Peter Porker or Miguel O'Hara or Marvel Noir Peter Parker, Spider-Gwen, there are so many different Spider people, if you have knowledge of the comics, that I always felt like the outrage around his introduction and his integral place in witnessing Galactus in the comics, in witnessing the multiversal convergence. I always felt like that was made a big deal by people who just didn't like a variant for a particular reason that we all know.
No, I'm glad you pointed out, because like I said, I'm like, everyone has their headcanon, I guess we like to call it. The Spider-Mans, they think they can exist. There's like, okay, well, why does this one bother you though? Like we've again have Spider-Mans in their own worlds for plenty of times in their own one. This is another one, and we like this one, and we're gonna lean into this one. So buckle up. Let's get it poppin'. And Miles is really such an interesting character to finally be able to be on screen, even though it is animated. But again, we wouldn't have had it if Spider-Man hadn't stayed such a popular character for so long. I mean, when we think of Marvel heroes, Spidey's top 3, in my opinion.
Top 1, basically. I mean, I know they want to elevate Captain America and the Hulk and all that, but Spider-Man has always been the one on the level of Batman and Superman in my mind, in terms of, like, when you think of a hero for a label, you think of Spider-Man first for Marvel, and that's just the way it is.
I don't disagree with you. I'm not gonna lie, because Spidey's still popping to this day. We have had so much content around Spider-Man in my lifetime. I mean, I feel like I grew up with Peter Parker.
We really have been inundated with Spider-Man content in our lifetimes. But I think it's important to note that, like, we grew up with Peter Parker in the Sam Raimi trilogy, and we sort of saw the Amazing Spider-Man films, although the Raimi movies, even with inflation, out-earned the Sony reboot. But the reason Miles is such an interesting Spider-Man to me to focus on is because of the fact that he's just a really likable kid. You know, it's not just representation for representation's sake. He has his own hopes and his own dreams and a very unique and positive way of communicating who he is as a person that just at the end of the day, comics and film, you just like him.
I mean, what's not to like about him? He's smart, he's witty, he's funny, he has flaws. He's an everyday person. As much as he is great representation, you also don't have to be from his world to like him and to resonate with him, to see yourself as that tiny teen going through puberty, dealing with some sort of new responsibility that's a part of you and wanting to rise to the challenge. I think that's what makes him so likable, is he doesn't get beat down. He doesn't let it get him down. Even when he goes through conflict and is clearly affected by it, he still wants to prove that he can do it, that he can become something more, that he has meaning and purpose. And the story that is told in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is one that I think has waited so long to exist. And I'm quite frankly ecstatic that the animation medium is the medium that one was chosen for a multiverse story that involves the Spider-Verse, because I don't know if live action could do it this well, especially at the time. But two, for the character that he is, being able to focus on him and give him the love that he deserves and kind of subverting, I think, expectations for an animated Spider-Man film. And this film, this animated feature, does that at every step of the way, starting from its development, Jack.
And it's interesting because Spider-Man was in a very dark kind of place in 2014. It's not that it was a dead entity on screen, but it was really languishing after the two Amazing Spider-Man films. They just had not made money. They had not been good critically. And Sony was sort of at a loss for what to do in 2014. So they were reaching out to multiple creative teams, including the original writers of the first draft of this, Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, who initially refused Sony's offer to engage with the project.
Yeah, and they did not want to do anything. Nobody wanted to do something. They're like, look, Peter Parker has been done so much already. Can we pass, please? How are we going to revitalize this when it's been done to the ground?
That's where they really seized on their ultimatum in getting involved with this pitch process and this development, was that they wanted to do 2014's Spider-Verse comic, which was the multiversal aspect of this story. And they wanted, because of that comic and because of the Ultimate Spider-Man series, to make Miles Morales as the protagonist. And this package heads to a very pivotal Sony pitch meeting between executives in January 2015, where multiple Spider-Man concepts were being discussed to revitalize the entity at Sony. And Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the animated concept about the multiverse, is the one that ultimately wins out.
And I'm glad that it did, because, like, I barely like the new Spider-Man movies, okay? Like, I really do. I'm over it. This is exactly what needed to be done. And I'm glad the people that can spend the big bucks and make the big decisions saw it that way, too. A lot of the time, there's conflict here in trying to get these concepts up to ground. So to hear that this concept was, like, championed above the rest and really stood out, it gives me hope that there are still good stories out there, Jack.
Well, it helped that a lot of really good creative voices would attach themselves to this project, starting with changes to the writing team, believe it or not. Lord and Miller wrote the first treatment of the script, but afterwards, Chris Miller would take a step back when Rodney Rothman would join the team and would actually allow Phil Lord to write with him, while Chris Miller would only maintain as a producer. And Rothman and Lord together would basically rewrite and revamp the entire script, including fitting sequences in after stuff had already been boarded and animated, to make this film work and to really tie together problems that were happening with the third act. To build up the directing backbone of this film, they brought in the story editor of Puss in Boots, Bob Paraschetti, and they brought in Peter Ramsey off of Rise of the Guardians.
And rightfully so. Bob and Peter, like, I think were the exact ingredients needed to make the perfect team to bring this together. They've had experience in the animation medium, but experience in telling very captivating stories and creating some very amazing worlds. I mean, Peter's also done a little work on Shrek as well. So, like, they had the experience in 3D animation, as well as 2D animation and thinking about how to tell stories, work with these characters, and again, create these believable and breathable worlds.
I think they really benefited as well from making sure that they were as referential and deferential to the source material as they possibly could be. Lord and Rothman made sure to be in constant contact with Brian Michael Bendis, the creator of Miles Morales, to ensure that the character was maintaining internal consistency of character and of identity between the comics and the film.
100%. I can attest this. I actually happened to be in the presence of greatness when I did a lot of stuff with the Blurred Girl. She's amazing. He did a wonderful interview with Peter Ramsey, and he really does attest to the team, the overall team's complete commitment and investment to making Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse the most authentic story possible. They really wanted Miles' story to come to life, and they put their all into it. All of themselves, pulling from direct inspirations from their own lives into the character, consulting with the people that need to be consulted, like you said, with the creators of the character to ensure continuity, but also with the animators, their opinions on the work, because the animators were heavily involved in this, especially when they definitely didn't have a lot in the room to start with.
This animation process is wild to me, just looking at it from the outside, because it ended up ballooning. The production was made at Sony Pictures Imageworks, which has a long and tried and true track record of solid animations. But they were being asked to do some processes that had never been done on film before. In particular, adapting 75, 80-year-old comic book techniques onto film for the very first time, including inking practices, certain paneling techniques, to the point where it took them 2 years to make a 10-second visual representation of the style that they wanted to with their first animator, Alberto Mielgo.
It was a grueling process. Like, you said it so perfectly. They literally, quite literally, were adapting comic books to animation in the very techniques that they were doing it. And it's wild. They literally had to create new technology to do this form of animation. And the animation, I guess, like, we can really dive into it. If you don't mind me, Jack, I'm going to geek out because I know you have a great reference for classic animation, and this really did play with that. I mean, they wanted to make and animate the characters on one form of animation style versus the backgrounds, which is wild. So they wanted to animate on twos. Ones and twos are the poses, the amount of poses that are per frame. When you do one pose per 1 second on the frame, it looks smooth and stuff, and the computer does the motion blur between them to make it all fluid and stuff. But when you animate on twos, you get a lot of punchy animation, and it's very like dynamic, and a lot of things kind of happen with emphasis. Like a lot of the famous classic films we've seen, 101 Dalmatians was animated on twos, and The Jungle Book was, but it's lost when you use motion blur. So they had to drop the motion blur and then find a way to make up for not having motion blur because they wanted to animate it this way. So they had to literally be like, how do we physically do this? And how do we make the computer know how to animate the background one way, animate this way, on top of rendering it at the end to make it have the stylistic stuff that we kind of love. And some of the stylistic stuff that is 2D is actually not just stylistic, but to literally give us the ability to see depth of field within the animation, that whole offset kind of level of it, that whole, is it 3D, is it not 3D moment, isn't just for style. It's so that you can actually see and translate and let your eyes process what is going on so you can see the animation work come to life. It is fascinating learning the techniques that were actually developed to create this film. For animation, it blew things out of the water. And I guarantee you, the one guy couldn't do a whole movie like this. It took 2 years for a proof of concept. We're going to need a team.
I mean, it got to the point where they were literally having CGI animators render frames, print them out, and allow 2D artists to work on top of them. Because this was an assembly line project with the levels of animation that you were working on. You couldn't do this with one animator. You had to start with, turns out, 60 animators. And then by August 2018, they'd realized that 60 animators wasn't enough. So they moved up to 142 animators on this project, with a maximum amount working simultaneously of 177 at one point. The largest ever animation staff by a single project in Sony history.
That's what was so cool when I was having that conversation with Peter Ramsey and like being able to be that fly on the wall for that interview. He really attests to how important this translation and important getting their vision across was, to committing to pitching to the studio to be like, we need this bandwidth. It has to look this way. This is going to be the only way we can do it. And they had that freedom to know that the studio was going to back them. Don't get me wrong, the crunch was real. They weren't changing their release times. So, there was no room to kind of find a way to make 60 animators work at all. No, they needed the bandwidth they did and still had crunch. But every single one of those animators really did bring their heart to it. I cannot say and like press enough how much involvement everyone kind of had on this. They workshop stuff together where people wanted to have those ideas, where people wanted to be like, hey, I want Jack Kirby's references there in his dot art style to be prevalent in a form of lighting translation. We want Sienkiewicz's version of Kingpin in this film because of how great it is and the message and the style that it brings. And we want people to recognize those references in our art style. That everything, like I geek out here because everything was intentional. Happy accident, sure, when things started to work, but it was for a reason. Sony said, go big or go home. So they said, okay, buckle up, Buttercup.
It's a big deal, not just because it offers so many potent reference points for comic book fans, but what it does for somebody like me who is, at best, a comic book neophyte. It creates a visual style in the frame that is so potent and so engaging. Like, you want to eat up and absorb every single inch of the frame with your eyes, that it lets you tell this very well-drawn story with these themes that are relevant to teenagers and young adults and older adults in equal measure by hiding it almost within this incredibly well-formed animation.
I'm so glad you put it that way because it is a feast for your eyes. But at the same time, as much fun that is, it really lays a foundation for some serious higher level themes and commentaries on superhero themes or just themes in real life. And I think the animators and the directors and creators on this project knew it when they were pitching this concept. I mean, it is phenomenal. I think one of the main stories that is told, taking up the mantle, seeing it in a way where visually anyone can wear the mask is a thing we've been told a lot and is in a lot of narratives throughout a lot of superhero history. But for the first time, we can visually see that because we have multiple protagonists, but it becomes something more than that. It becomes a greater story. It's only one level to visually show you that, but to make the story of the movie that, it's phenomenal work to me, Jack.
And I think it's cool how that anyone can wear the mask concept, really visualized in this film, allows Spider-Man to serve as an avatar for personal belief. And it gets to what I kind of think the central message of this film is. Belief comes from within. The leaps of faith that you take as a person come from within. You're not always going to be prepared with the confidence of experience to do something. And a lot of Miles' journey in this film, particularly in his relation to role models, is modeled around that struggle. He is confronted with a trope that you see not just in this film, but that you see all over Black filmmaking in our lifetimes, is you see this duality that he has to face between his dad, Jefferson, who is this avatar of building up social responsibility and taking on a broader familial responsibility, versus his uncle Aaron, who takes on the quote-unquote responsibilities of the streets. And that duality is presented a lot for kids who have to grow up in the inner city. And Miles is confronted with that in a very naive way early on, where he sees his father as this overbearing parent and he sees his Uncle Aaron as the cool, rebellious guy.
I love those characters though, because really they're pulled from the director's own life experience. Like it's just another testament to how close to heart these themes are. Uncle Aaron was directly influenced by Bob's own uncle. The father was directly influenced by Peter Ramsey's own father. People really dug deep with characterizing these characters and building out the story and the relationships there. I think the role model theme, to your point, Jack, is so strong. I mean, throughout the film, Miles is desperately trying to find role models within his own life, finding that father figure within the Spider-Verse, trying to find those connections, to be able to find friendship and connection and meaning to others outside of yourself. I mean, when you're a teenager, you go through, I think, your first existential crisis of finding your place in the world. It's really a coming of age. And I think that this film does such a great job at showing that a coming of age story isn't just tied to being a teen. I mean, when we have our Peter Parker from the other world who's ruined his relationship with the love of his life, he comes through his own coming of age story of his midlife crisis. Every person throughout this film kind of comes into themselves and really becomes a different person. And I think it kind of leans onto a theme that you pointed out, Jack, so well. And I want you to kind of go off on what you mean by shared humanity.
I said it in our notes that I think that parallel existence and shared humanity is a big kind of backbone of this story as well. And I think it fits into that theme of growing up, because as the story goes on, the way that Miles grows up is he comes to understand something that we all have to understand when we grow up. The people we idolize, the people that we want to shape ourselves after, they are just as flawed and as fallible as we are as human beings. They have rational and irrational motivations just like we do. They have a sense of self that is as strong as our own. And part of becoming an adult, becoming a responsible person, is understanding that that exists as an inner universe within every single person. And it's visually represented here by creating all these different looking Spider-Mans who on the face of it only share these powers that they have. But when you dig into the core of it, what they share, their experiences with loss, their experiences with disappointment, their experiences with joy and success, there's a commonality to that emotion that is allowed to breathe throughout the course of this film. And it's rare to see shared humanity have the opportunity to be represented like that visually.
I love that. Like that is not what you wrote. Just so you know, you said a lot more than what you wrote.
You said go off, so I went off.
Yeah, it was beautiful because it is true. It's a story that I think needed to be told, especially in our current climate right now, where a lot of times we do forget that we are all connected, that we do have those shared experiences. And I kind of even want to dive a little deeper. And I know we're getting to the point where we're talking about, how we feel about it. And I think the theme that resonated with me personally the most was having a Black story about family. That is the Black existence right there. So to have our Black Spider-Man be the Spider-Man that is kind of bridging the story of what is family, what is it to be a good person, like you're saying, and being the vessel of these very, very deep and thought-provoking themes, and being that narrative vessel of this story of some kid on the block. With great power comes great responsibility. Like, I'm about to cry. Holy cow, I didn't think that was going to hit me that way. And as corny as that line is, and they joke about it in the movie, is very self-aware. For the Black experience, with great power comes great responsibility. With existing comes great responsibility for us. So to see a character genuinely not have any racial tensions, that's not a problem in his story. He doesn't fight that. He doesn't combat it. It's not a part of the story. And it is about something more than that. That right there is what makes this film be one of my favorite movies. It does something that you don't see in a genre that I love and hold dear, and I know has flaws and is working to be better. To see this film have so much passion behind it, and to tell a story that can resonate with anybody. Like, I attest to that this is a movie for everyone. You don't get that every day.
I think that family theme is highly resonant because it is a family that you and I, having lived in New York as long as we have spent times living in New York, it's the type of family that we see every day. Miles is the product of, an African-American father and a Puerto Ricano mother. He hears English and Spanish in his own house. Seeing the kid go down the block and head to school, it's a block that you or I would recognize in Brooklyn. When he goes to Aunt May's house, it is unquestionably a house in Queens. It's interesting that we have that connection as New Yorkers to seeing him as just this kid who lives in this city that we know and love. But beyond that, it's hard for me to understand as somebody who has always been able to readily access positive representations of families. Even, as a kid descended from the Irish Americans, who we haven't always been portrayed the best, but we've always had representation of white faces on a screen interacting in the way that is just family taken as a given, taken as a functioning unit that loves each other and that works as itself. And to see that representation on film and to see the way that it impacts people, like, how could you devalue that?
Gosh, I can't believe I got so emotional, but it's the truth. It's definitely the truth. And as an animator fan, to find out that groundbreaking processes were made to create and tell this story, it's empowering and it gives me hope for the future of nerdom. I really, 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 really love it. Just the little things, like some of the little things of just not having the subtitles for the Spanish because they want the audience to experience how Miles would have experienced it. It's all of it. It's all of it coming together in a beautiful story that is well done, that doesn't lose your attention for 1 second. Not 1 second are you not fully invested in this. And for something that is animated, for animation that seems to have come from a history of getting a bad rep or getting decredited for being a credible medium, I love what this does for animation and what it does for superheroes. And I think the box office agrees with me.
Yeah, no, it clearly wasn't just highly resonant with you, BK, because this would make $375 million to date worldwide. It has officially surpassed Hotel Transylvania 2 as Sony's highest grossing animation ever. And it's something that if you look at it critically, fan response, critic response is almost near universal praise. I mean, it's beloved by some of the biggest comic-associated luminaries in Hollywood. Kevin Smith loves this film. Kevin Feige loves this film. Rian Johnson loves this film. There are so many people who are influenced by comics who cite this as a landmark achievement in filmmaking. And it's at the point where it won Best Animated Feature at the Oscars when it came out, ending a 6-year Disney streak of just taking that award home every time they showed up. And to this day, it has had a carryover effect in the technical world of influencing a whole new generation of filmmakers to mix in 2D animation work and CGI into what they're doing. Most notably seen this year in Ms. Marvel.
I'm glad you said that too, because it really is true. They are the starters of this. They've really laid the groundwork and shown that it can be done and that there is a need and want for this direct as possible translation. There are a lot of adaptations out there in the world right now. We are in the realm of adaptations where everything in their mom is getting adapted. There's something to be said about Spider-Man to the Spider-Verse where it tried to be the best one for one. I think anything has really tried to be. I think this film has set a precedence that people should not be afraid to really lean into the source material in earnest, give love to where these kind of greats come from and try to tell that story. Try to give the best love and best support of translating that story to screen in an accessible medium. And if you have to create new technology to do that, maybe you just have to do it. I mean, this film has really just kind of set the stage for the Marvel Ultimate Universe and has crazy multiverse implications for the future of the MCU. I have faith that we're going to see some great, great, great stories here. I really do. Amongst some of the bombs that have happened recently in the MCU world, there is an uptick of people caring more, being fans of the material itself, from fans being cast in front of the camera to as well as the creators of these projects being genuine lovers of the original material. I think we are going to get some of the best superhero films really, really soon. I think the later phases of MCU are going to be great. And I think it's a testament to this film right here, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and its sequel, Jack. That's happening.
It's cool to hear how hyped you are about these implications and about this discussion, because it gets back to what the value of these films are. And again, what I said up top in the podcast, if you're listening and you hear the anticipation and the excitement in BK's voice, what you're hearing is that the material that's being engaged with by a human being matters to them. And that's really all that's required about a good story. Does it engage you? Does it bind you to other people? Does it make you want to share that story? And Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse's greatest achievement might be the fact that it's a story that makes you want to share. There is so much of a reward in the frame, in the story, in the acting performances that we haven't even had time to cover. Like, there is so much about the film that will resonate with you at different levels, that it is a worthy access point no matter what level you want to define it on as art.
I totally forgot about we don't even have time to talk about some of the amazing voices that literally grace this film. I mean, when I say Sony pulled out the stops, it's just something to be excited about, that a superhero thing, what once used to be niche and culty, is getting celebrities to do what we can do, amazing comedians to be in the right roles that they are. I could go on and on and on about how great these actors brought themselves to the characters, but also were earnest to the message and the story that they wanted to tell. I love it. I'm geeking out, but I love it. It's a fun movie. The care, the sauce. There's so much sauce with this. And I know I could geek out all night, Jack, so thank you for letting me have that time to just express how much I love everything about this film and be able to share it with you. I didn't realize you had seen it before. And then watching it again, hearing your excitement too, I go, okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one who likes this, right?
No. Near universal appeal. Rotten Tomatoes isn't always wrong.
Oh, man.
I've had such a good time getting to discuss this with you, and it makes me almost a little bit guilty for next week, because we're jumping into some pretty serious fare when we next return to your airwaves.
Yes, we do have a very different film coming up next. Again, something that's not my pick, it's actually Jack's pick, and I'm excited because Jack always is 10 for 10 at broadening my horizons and putting me on to stuff I ain't even never heard of. So I can't wait to share this with y'all. Jack, why don't you tee up what we're going to be getting into for the next episode?
Well, what we're doing is technically our second foray into French film. We did do The Fifth Element in the first season, but this is our first true out-and-out French foreign language film, because we are going to watch 1995's La Haine, spelled Haine for those of you who don't know French, directed by Matthew Kassovitz. And this little film from France is one of the most potent social commentaries I have ever seen.
You know me, Jack. I am a stand for foreign films. I think the West is such a closed and isolated place, and we are dumb Americans. And there's so much great art out there in the world that I jump on a chance to be able to be exposed to something that I clearly have not seen or heard of. So I'm so excited to see what this has to bring us. And I know it's going to be awesome to share it with y'all once we do our dives and our wiki dives, our research, and check out this viewing. I cannot wait to geek out with everybody. I think that is it for us on our Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse episode. I think we had way too much to say and still more to say. We could have probably done another 30 minutes of this easily, Jack.
Oh, easily. We were getting to points where we were cramming, so I'm impressed with us, to be honest.
Yes, well, if you think we might have missed anything or you just have any other stuff you want to say, you can get all those deets and stuff on our Twitter at RFN_podcast or on Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds there. Check us out. If you're following BK or Jack's socials, you can know when we're doing any watch parties just to share some of these really good flicks we have that we think would be good viewings with the community. So if you want to know when that stuff is happening, again, check us out Follow us on the interwebs there. That's when you'll find out first. But until next time, y'all, thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks for listening.
Until next week.
See you around.